2015. On the bank of a river in Michigan, a new palace of Henry Ford rises. Inside, marble, gardens, its own waterfall. Outside, lines of workers who are afraid of being even 1 minute late. This is the dark story of Henry Ford's mansion empire. A story about how the man who gave the world cheap cars built himself an entire empire of mansions, and at the same time an empire of control over other people's lives. In these houses, everything had to look perfect. Perfect gardens, perfect dinners, perfect families. But behind the walls, there was another life. Servants who were not allowed to get sick, workers whose private lives were checked by inspectors, wives and children who lived by rules they did not write. Some of Ford's estates still shine like museums. Others slowly rot, grow over with weeds, and hide the stories of people whose fear and exhaustion paid for that shine. What was it really? A dream of a better world? Or a giant theater of control where even in the most luxurious halls, no one truly felt free? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1. The Mansion Under Tarps. The first thing visitors notice about Fair Lane today is not its grandeur. It is the scaffolding. Blue tarps cling to stretches of limestone wall. Cracks spider across window frames that once held custom-blown glass. The gardens, once famous for thousands of roses and rare birds, now fight a quiet war against neglect, staff cuts, and shrinking restoration budgets. This is the main residence of Henry Ford, a man who, at his peak, stood among the richest people on earth. The man who changed how the world moved, how factories operated, how ordinary families could suddenly afford a car of their own. And yet his own house sits partially wrapped in protective sheeting, waiting for restoration funds that never seem to arrive quickly enough. Fair Lane was supposed to be different from the mansions of Ford's competitors. The Vanderbilts built French chateaux on Fifth Avenue. The Carnegies filled their homes with European art and gilded ceilings. Ford wanted something else. He wanted a house that looked like it grew out of the land, a place where nature and machine could exist side by side without one swallowing the other. The estate sprawls across more than 1,000 acres along the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan. Ford and his wife Clara chose this land deliberately. It was close enough to the factories to reach them quickly, yet far enough to escape the noise and smoke of industrial Detroit. A retreat, but not an exile. A home, but also a statement about how he believed life should be organized. Construction began in 1914 and took nearly 2 years. The architects blended elements of the prairie style with English country house traditions. 56 rooms, spread across multiple wings. A powerhouse on the property generated electricity from the river itself, Ford's personal experiment in self-sufficiency. The message was simple and deliberate. This estate would depend on no one. But understanding Fair Lane means understanding what it was built to escape and what it was built to control. Henry Ford hated disorder. He hated unpredictability. He hated the chaos of cities, the messiness of human behavior, the inefficiency of lives lived without structure. His factories ran on rigid schedules, precise movements, standardized parts. Every second counted. Every motion was measured. Fair Lane was meant to be the domestic version of this philosophy. The grounds were landscaped according to detailed plans. The gardens followed strict botanical arrangements. Inside, servants moved along designated routes, appeared and disappeared through hidden doors, followed schedules that accounted for every hour of their day. Clara Ford wanted comfort. She wanted quality without ostentation, warmth without waste. She chose simple but well-made furniture, fabrics that would last, colors that soothed rather than shouted for attention. Her influence softened the edges of the house, and kept it from becoming just another monument to excess. Henry, meanwhile, experimented. He tested new heating systems, new electrical configurations, new materials. The house became a laboratory as much as a home. Guests reportedly found themselves turned into subjects of Ford's latest theories about diet, lighting, sleep schedules. What worked in the factory, Ford believed, could work in any environment, including his own living room. From the outside, Fair Lane looked like peace itself. Stone walls, quiet woods, the sound of water pushing through the powerhouse turbines. But peace at Fair Lane came with conditions. It existed only as long as everyone inside accepted rules they had no part in writing. The servants understood this first. The family would learn it later, and eventually the pattern would repeat. In workers' houses, in distant jungle cities, in every corner of an empire built not just on cars, but on the belief that one man's vision of order should govern how everyone else lived. Chapter 2. Fair Lane. The house that would tame chaos. The servants who worked at Fair Lane quickly learned that employment there meant more than cooking meals or trimming hedges. It meant surrendering to a system. Bellboards lined the service corridors. Each bell corresponded to a room, a need, an expectation. When a bell rang, response time mattered. Delays were noticed. Repeated delays led to conversations. Conversations led to departures. The household staff numbered in the dozens during Fair Lane's peak years. Gardeners, cooks, maids, chauffeurs, mechanics for the powerhouse, caretakers for the birds Ford kept on the grounds. Each had a role and clearly marked limits. The hidden staircases and service passages that threaded through the house were not merely architectural conveniences. They were instruments of invisibility. Servants were expected to appear when needed and vanish when not. Their presence should quietly solve problems without ever becoming one. Clara Ford, by most accounts, treated the staff with genuine kindness. She remembered names, asked about families, showed concern during illnesses. Yet Clara's warmth operated inside a framework she had not designed. The schedules, the expectations, the underlying philosophy of the household, these belonged to Henry. Ford's obsession with control extended to the smallest details. He held firm beliefs about diet, and those theories shaped what appeared on the household table. Guests at Fair Lane reportedly encountered meals built around soybeans, whole grains, and vegetables grown on the estate. Ford saw food as fuel, and fuel should be optimized. Personal preference ranked below efficiency. The same logic applied to daily routines. Ford rose early. He expected others to do the same. He believed in the moral value of work and the danger of idleness. Leisure, in his view, required justification. Even relaxation at Fair Lane had a productive purpose. Walks that doubled as inspections of the grounds, conversations that circled back to business, reading that reinforced convictions he already held. This created an atmosphere visitors described in contradictory terms. Some found Fair Lane peaceful, a welcome escape from the noise of Detroit. Others felt watched, measured, quietly evaluated. The beauty of the gardens and the comfort of the rooms existed alongside an invisible pressure, the sense that someone was always keeping score. The staff felt this most acutely. Accounts from former employees, gathered by researchers decades later, paint a picture of unpredictability wrapped in rigid structure. Ford could be generous. He paid well by the standards of the time. He provided housing for some workers, supported their families during hardships, remembered birthdays and anniversaries. But generosity at Fair Lane came without guarantees. A servant who pleased Ford 1 month might find themselves dismissed the next over a minor infraction. The rules were clear until they suddenly changed. Loyalty earned credit, but that credit could evaporate without warning. This pattern, control dressed as care, structure that promised security but delivered anxiety, would repeat throughout Ford's empire. Fair Lane was simply the first laboratory, the house where Ford tested his ideas about how people should live, how households should run, how order could be imposed on the chaos of human existence. Outside the estate's stone walls, a larger experiment was already taking shape. A few miles away, the Rouge River plant was growing into one of the largest industrial complexes in the world. And between the factory and the mansion, Ford was building something else entirely. Rows of small houses, neat lawns, identical windows facing identical streets. A neighborhood designed not by the people who would live there, but by the man who employed them. If Fair Lane was Ford's private laboratory, these workers' houses would become his public one, a place where the principles tested behind mansion walls could be applied to hundreds of families at once. A place where the line between employer and landlord would blur until it disappeared completely. Chapter 3. Model Streets. The Ford Homes Historic District. The houses looked like something from a catalog, and in a way they were. Neat brick structures lined the streets of Dearborn, just minutes from the Rouge plant. Small front porches, modest yards, windows that caught the morning light. For families who had spent years in cramped tenements or overcrowded boarding houses, these homes represented a transformation so complete it felt almost unreal. Tom and Anna. Names borrowed to protect real families whose stories survive only in fragments, arrived in Dearborn in the early 1920s. Both were children of immigrants. Both knew the particular exhaustion of industrial work without industrial wages. When they received the keys to their Ford Company house, Anna reportedly stood in the kitchen for several minutes without speaking. Running water, a gas stove, a bathroom inside the house itself, a small yard where children could play without dodging streetcars and delivery wagons. For families like theirs, the Ford housing program solved problems that had seemed permanent. The rent was reasonable. The commute to the factory took minutes instead of hours. The neighborhood was clean, safe, orderly. Compared to the chaos of Detroit's working-class districts, these streets felt like another country entirely. But the keys came with conditions, and those conditions revealed something important about the nature of the gift. Rent was tied directly to employment. Lose your job at Ford, and you lost your home. There was no separation between workplace and residence, no buffer between professional failure and personal catastrophe. The security of the house depended entirely on the security of the position, and positions at Ford were never truly secure. The rules extended well beyond employment status. The Ford Sociological Department, a name that sounds almost satirical now but was completely serious then, employed investigators whose job was to visit workers' homes. They checked for cleanliness. They asked about drinking habits. They inquired whether children attended school regularly, whether wives managed household budgets responsibly, whether families attended church. What looked like a simple home inspection quickly became an audit of an entire way of life. The official purpose was improvement. Ford believed that higher wages meant nothing if workers wasted money on alcohol or gambling. He wanted to create not just employees, but model citizens. The famous $5 day came with strings attached. To qualify for the full amount, workers had to pass inspection. Their homes had to meet standards. Their lives had to align with Ford's vision of proper American living. For some families, this felt like support. The investigators offered advice on nutrition, savings plans, English language classes for recent immigrants. They connected struggling families with resources, intervened in domestic disputes, helped navigate the bewildering machinery of early 20th century bureaucracy. For others, the visits felt like surveillance. The questions probed deep into private matters. How much did you spend last month? Does your husband drink? Why were your children absent from school on Tuesday? The boundary between help and intrusion blurred until it effectively disappeared. Neighbors learned to watch each other. A complaint about noise or an unkempt lawn could trigger an inspection. A rumor about a family argument could reach the Sociological Department within days. The streets remained beautiful, the houses well maintained, the lawns trimmed to acceptable lengths. But beneath the surface order ran currents of anxiety that never fully dissipated. One family on Tom and Anna's street lost their home after the husband was fired, following a dispute on the assembly line. Within weeks, they were packing their belongings. The house that had seemed like salvation became just another temporary stop, another reminder that security in Ford's world was always conditional and always revocable. The neighborhood endured. The houses still stand today, many of them occupied by descendants of the original families. But the story they tell is more complicated than any catalog photograph or real estate brochure could capture. And if the workers' streets represented Ford's vision applied to hundreds, another project was taking shape that would apply it to thousands. Not in Michigan, but deep in the Amazon rainforest. Chapter 4. Gaukler Point. The Gilded Cage of Edsel and Eleanor. The stone house on the shore of Lake St. Clair looked nothing like Fair Lane. Where Henry Ford's estate emphasized self-sufficiency and experimentation, the home of his son Edsel and daughter-in-law Eleanor followed a different vision entirely. Cotswold architecture, lead-paned windows, limestone walls that seemed to have grown out of the earth itself, gardens that slid gently toward the water with an elegance that felt ancient, even though the house was barely a decade old. Edsel Ford had spent his life navigating a contradiction. He was heir to one of the largest fortunes in American history, yet he worked under a father who distrusted inherited wealth. He loved modern art, European design, architectural innovation, tastes his father viewed with suspicion at best and open contempt at worst. Edsel wanted to build something beautiful. Henry wanted to build something useful. The estate at Gaukler Point became Edsel's answer to that conflict. If he could not reshape the Ford Motor Company according to his own vision, he could at least shape his home. Construction began in 1926. The architect Albert Kahn, already famous for designing Ford's vast industrial plants, received a different kind of commission. No exposed steel here. No assembly line logic. Instead, Kahn created a house that looked as though it had stood for centuries. Hand-cut stone, massive chimneys, rooms that opened onto one another with a warmth Fair Lane's more rigid corridors never achieved. Eleanor Ford filled those rooms with art. Diego Rivera, Paul Cézanne, paintings and drawings that challenged and provoked, that embodied everything Henry Ford found suspicious about modern culture. The walls of Gaukler Point became a quiet rebellion, a gallery of tastes the patriarch could not control. But rebellion has limits when the rebel still depends on the empire. After dinner parties, Eleanor would sometimes step onto the terrace overlooking the lake. The water stretched toward the horizon, dark and calm. And somewhere beyond that line of darkness, on the far side of the city sprawl, the rouge plant glowed against the night sky. Furnaces that never cooled, assembly lines that never stopped, the source of everything that made this beautiful house possible. Eleanor understood the exchange, the stone beneath her feet, the paintings on her walls, the gardens where her children played. All of it traced back to those distant fires, to the workers who arrived before dawn and left after dark, to the accidents, the exhaustion, the lives slowly consumed by the machinery of production. She managed this knowledge the way many in her position did, through philanthropy, through careful attention to causes that mattered, through a genuine effort to use wealth responsibly. But the fundamental equation remained unchanged. Beauty here was purchased by labor there. Comfort in this house was subsidized by discomfort in countless others. Edsel himself grew increasingly ill during the 1930s. Stomach problems that doctors struggled to diagnose. Fatigue that did not lift. At the same time, stress piled up year after year as he fought losing battles against his father's decisions. Henry Ford had a fixed vision for the company, and that vision did not include the changes Edsel believed were necessary. The son's ideas were overruled, his appointments reversed, his authority quietly undermined by lieutenants who reported directly to the father. The lake house became a refuge from these struggles, a place where Edsel could walk the gardens without encountering his father's disapproval, where Eleanor could raise their children according to values that differed, subtly but significantly, from those that governed life at Fair Lane. Yet even here, the shadow reached. Every comfort depended on the continued success of the enterprise. Every beautiful object existed because the factories kept running, the workers kept producing, the system kept turning. Gaukler Point was a gentler cage than Fair Lane. But it was still a cage, and far to the south, in a jungle that none of them would ever visit, Henry Ford was building the largest cage of all. Chapter 5. Fordlândia. The mansion in the jungle, built as a city. The telegram arrived in Dearborn with numbers that would have staggered most businessmen. 2.5 million acres. An area larger than some American states. Land grants from the Brazilian government that promised Henry Ford something he had never fully possessed: control over his own supply chain. Rubber. The Ford Motor Company consumed it by the ton. For tires, hoses, gaskets, every component that needed flexibility and resilience. And nearly all of it came from British and Dutch plantations in Southeast Asia. Prices shifted according to foreign decisions. Supply depended on distant governments and distant crises. For a man who had built his empire on self-sufficiency, this dependence felt intolerable. The solution, as Ford saw it, appeared straightforward. Grow his own rubber. In the Amazon basin, where rubber trees originated, where the climate seemed perfect, where land cost almost nothing and labor even less, build a plantation, build a processing facility, build, in effect, an entire city that answered only to him. Fordlândia began to rise from the jungle in 1928. American managers arrived with blueprints drafted in Michigan, streets laid out in rigid grid patterns, houses constructed in familiar Midwestern styles, clapboard siding, pitched roofs, front porches facing neighbors across tidy lanes, a water tower stamped with the Ford logo, a hospital, schools. A central square where workers could gather under the constant gaze of company supervisors. The goal was not merely production. The goal was transformation. Ford believed that American methods, American values, American routines could be exported anywhere. The jungle, in his mind, was raw material waiting to be organized. The local population was labor waiting to be improved. João arrived in Fordlândia in 1929. Chiu, drawn by wages that sounded miraculous compared to what he could earn elsewhere in the region. His name appears in no official records. He stands in for dozens of workers whose individual stories survive only in fragments. What he found when he stepped off the boat was a town unlike anything in his experience. American houses, American food, American rules. The cafeteria served oatmeal, whole wheat bread, canned vegetables. Foods Ford believed promoted health and efficiency. Local dishes were discouraged. Local cooking was treated as a problem to be corrected. Workers were expected to adopt not just American labor practices but American lifestyles, to live in American houses, eat American meals, and organize their days according to American schedules. Alcohol was prohibited. The Amazon had a long tradition of local brewing, drinks fermented from native fruits, cantinas where workers gathered after exhausting days. Fordlândia banned all of it. In its place, recreation was organized around activities labeled wholesome: square dances, poetry readings, gardening competitions. Entertainment that might have felt normal in Dearborn felt oddly staged and out of place in the dense tropical heat. The workday followed factory logic: fixed hours, supervised tasks, time clocks that recorded arrivals and departures with mechanical precision, but the jungle ran on different rhythms. Rubber trees produced best when tapped in the cool hours before dawn, not during the standardized daytime shifts that Ford's managers imposed. Local tappers understood this from experience. American supervisors, trained in assembly line thinking, did not. Housing assignments reflected hierarchies imported directly from Michigan. American staff lived in larger homes on higher ground, with better ventilation and screened windows. Brazilian workers were placed in smaller structures closer to the river, where mosquitoes bred in standing water and malaria moved through entire neighborhoods in waves. The message was architectural. The layout of the town, the distribution of resources, the physical distance between management and labor, all of it communicated a vision of order that placed some lives above others. Fordlândia was not merely a plantation. It was Fair Lane expanded to urban scale, a mansion philosophy stretched over thousands of people who had never asked to live inside someone else's dream. And like all dreams imposed without consent, this one would eventually provoke a response. The workers of Fordlândia were about to show what happens when the demand for control finally pushes past its limits. Chapter 6: Riot in the Cafeteria. The breaking point came over a meal. December 1930. The wet season had turned Fordlândia's dirt roads into rivers of mud. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that workers wrapped cloths around their faces just to breathe. Malaria had already claimed dozens of lives. Morale, never strong, had sunk to levels that made the American managers visibly nervous. Then the cafeteria announced a new policy. Workers would no longer be served at tables. Instead, they would line up, receive their food on trays, and eat in scheduled shifts. Factory style. Efficiency, now applied to digestion. For men who had endured months of foreign food, foreign rules, and foreign supervisors who spoke no Portuguese and showed little interest in learning, this last change felt like an insult, layered onto exhaustion. The line between order and humiliation had finally been crossed. It started with shouting, voices rising over the clatter of trays. Then plates began to fly. Workers overturned tables, smashed windows, hurled kitchen equipment into the muddy streets outside. Pots and pans crashed against walls. The neat, controlled cafeteria was suddenly unrecognizable. The American managers bolted for the river. Some reportedly commandeered boats and pushed off in panic, watching from the water as the town they had drawn on blueprints in Michigan now erupted in chaos behind them. The riot lasted only a few hours. Brazilian military forces arrived and restored order with rifles and discipline. No Americans were killed, though several suffered injuries in the scramble. The physical damage, broken glass, wrecked furniture, shattered dishes, was substantial but ultimately repairable. What could not be repaired was the illusion. Fordlândia had been built on the belief that American systems, properly applied, could transform any environment and any population. The riot exposed what the managers had refused to see. The workers were not raw material. They were people with their own customs, their own pride, their own threshold for how much control they would tolerate. And the trouble went far beyond cafeteria rules or hurt feelings. The core of the project, the rubber itself, was failing. Ford's planners had made a catastrophic error. In Southeast Asia, rubber trees grew in carefully spaced rows, separated enough to slow the spread of disease. Those plantations relied on trees transplanted long ago from the Amazon. But in their native environment, the trees had evolved alongside natural predators and pathogens. South American leaf blight, a fungal disease that had always existed in the Amazon, was normally held in check by the loose, irregular spacing of wild rubber trees across the forest. When Ford's managers planted trees in dense, perfectly ordered rows, copying the layout that worked in Malaysia, they accidentally created perfect conditions for disaster. The fungus leapt from leaf to leaf, tree to tree, turning carefully planned groves into sickly fields. Branches blackened, leaves fell. Entire plantations could be wiped out within a few seasons. Local workers and Brazilian agricultural experts had warned about this. They knew the forest's logic. They understood how disease moved through the canopy. Their warnings were noted, then brushed aside. The men making decisions in Dearborn knew factories. They knew assembly lines. They did not know tropical agriculture. And more dangerously, they did not believe they needed to learn. By the mid-1930s, Fordlândia was failing on every front. Production targets went unmet year after year. Costs rose, while yields declined. The hospital treated wave after wave of patients for malaria, dengue, and other tropical diseases faster than the workforce could recover. The model American town in the jungle was becoming a model study in American overconfidence. Ford's response was characteristic. He did not walk away. Instead, he doubled down. A second site, called Belterra, was established on higher ground, with supposedly better soil and a more favorable climate. More money flowed in. New machinery was shipped upriver. More managers arrived, carrying fresh briefcases, fresh optimism, and the same blind spots. The pattern began to repeat almost immediately. Henry Ford himself never visited either site, not once. He directed the entire project from Dearborn, studying reports and photographs, issuing orders based on information filtered through layers of managers inclined to tell him what they believed he wanted to hear. For him, the jungle existed as an abstraction. Lines on a map, numbers in a ledger, a problem to be solved through the firm application of American principles. Meanwhile, the people who actually lived in Fordlândia adapted in the only ways they could. Workers smuggled alcohol past company inspectors. Families prepared traditional foods in their homes when supervisors were not watching. Neighbors maintained their own social rhythms beneath the imposed schedules, their own informal networks beneath the official charts and diagrams. The town that was supposed to reshape them had itself been reshaped into a monument to the limits of control, standing in the middle of a rainforest that refused to behave like anyone's factory floor. Chapter 7. When the lights in the mansions go dark. The empire Henry Ford built aged faster than anyone expected. Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947, during a power outage at Fair Lane. The man who had built his own hydroelectric plant, who had insisted on self-sufficiency in all things, passed away by candlelight when the Rouge River flooded and knocked out his generators. He was 83 years old. Clara followed him in less than 3 years. The house that had once hummed with controlled activity fell quiet. For a time, the Ford Motor Company maintained the property, unsure what to do with a 56-room estate that no one wanted to occupy. Eventually, Fair Lane passed to the University of Michigan at Dearborn. The school lacked the money for careful restoration. Decades of deferred repairs piled up like unpaid debts. Water seeped through stone walls. Wooden beams rotted in places visitors never saw. The gardens that Clara had loved grew wild, then overgrown, then nearly impenetrable. The powerhouse that once showcased Ford's attempt to master nature fell silent, its turbines rusted in place, its original purpose fading from memory. Fair Lane was not alone in its decline. The Ford Rotunda, a massive exhibition hall that had welcomed millions of visitors, burned to the ground in 1962 during roof repairs. The fire consumed the building in less than an hour. Photographs from that day show smoke rising over Dearborn like a funeral pyre for an entire era. Other landmarks simply vanished. Factory buildings were demolished. Worker housing was remodeled beyond recognition. The physical infrastructure of Ford's empire was erased piece by piece, replaced by parking lots, low-rise offices, and strip malls that bore almost no trace of what had stood there before. At Gaukler Point, the story turned in a different direction. Edsel Ford had died in 1943, 4 years before his father, worn down by illness and the endless struggle against Henry's interference. Eleanor remained in the lake house, raising their children, supporting causes, tending the gardens that had brought her husband brief moments of peace during his difficult final years. She understood exactly what the estate represented, and what might happen if she simply left it to heirs who could sell to the highest bidder. The shoreline of Lake St. Clair was valuable real estate. Without protection, the stone house and its grounds would be chopped into lots, the lawns paved over, the art collection scattered through auction catalogs. In 1976, Eleanor Ford donated the estate to a public trust. The house became a museum. The gardens opened to visitors who would never have passed through the gates while the family lived there. Rooms designed for private life now hosted school groups, architecture buffs, and casual tourists. What had been private became shared. What had been exclusive became accessible. Yet even this act of generosity carried echoes of the old contradictions. The docents who lead tours today tell carefully curated stories. The art receives attention. The architecture earns admiration. The labor that made it all possible. The workers at Rouge. The servants moving through back corridors. The gardeners who kept those lawns and borders immaculate appears mostly in asides and footnotes. In Dearborn, the Ford Homes Historic District survived through stubbornness more than strategy. Some original families stayed, passing houses from one generation to the next, despite rising taxes and pressure to sell. Others left, replaced by new residents who knew nothing of the Sociological Department, the inspections, or the conditional nature of those early leases. The neighborhood eventually earned historic designation in the late 20th century, protecting it from wholesale demolition but also freezing it in a particular moment. The houses look much as they did nearly a century ago. The stories behind their brick walls and clipped hedges remain far harder to see, and in Brazil, Fordlândia entered its longest chapter, not as a functioning company town, but as something stranger, a place where the past refuses to fully disappear, where rusted machinery stands beside new concrete, where children play in the shadows of buildings their great-grandparents once worked inside. The mansions were going dark, but the people who had lived within their systems, in estates, in model streets, in jungle towns, were still finding ways to bend those spaces to their own lives, long after the original vision had faded. Chapter 8. The Quiet Work of Rescue. The scaffolding went up slowly, so slowly that some visitors wondered if it would ever come down at all. Fair Lane's restoration did not begin with grand ceremonies or dramatic unveilings. It began with small repairs in forgotten corners, a leak patched in one roof valley, a beam quietly stabilized above a hallway no longer in use. Work carried out in the margins, funded by donations too modest for headlines, but too vital to ignore. The people who took on this task understood something the original builders had never really considered. Preservation is not about freezing time. It is about deciding which stories are allowed to survive. A stonemason named David, one of several craftsmen whose names surface in the restoration records, spent months learning how to speak the language of the original limestone. The quarry that supplied Fair Lane had closed decades earlier. Finding stone that would not look wrong required research trips, sample cuts, and a long process of trial and error. Every new block had to blend into walls laid nearly a century before, hiding the seam where present work touched past ambition. In the archives, a young researcher named Maria worked through boxes no one had opened in years, letters from servants, invoices from local suppliers, schedules listing who worked where, when, and for how much. The paper was brittle, the ink fading, the pages threatening to crumble if handled without care. As she assembled this material, a different picture of Fair Lane began to emerge. Not just a story about one wealthy couple in a large stone house, but a map of an entire ecosystem. Gardeners who maintained hundreds of acres through Michigan winters and summers. Cooks who adjusted menus to match Henry Ford's shifting dietary theories. Mechanics who coaxed the powerhouse turbines through storms and power surges. Names that had never appeared in biographies surfaced from the files, attached to lives that unfolded almost entirely within the estate's boundaries. The restoration team made a choice that would have baffled Henry Ford. They decided to tell all of it. Not only the innovations and the architectural beauty, but also the conditions and the costs. Service corridors would be included in the tour routes. The stories of workers would stand beside the stories of owners. Fair Lane would become not a shrine to one man's vision, but an honest record of how that vision shaped and was reshaped by everyone it touched. This approach demanded resources that standard preservation budgets rarely cover. Oral history projects to capture memories before they disappeared. Community outreach to find former staff and their families. Educational programs designed not to flatter visitors, but to invite them into a more complicated truth. Progress remained slow precisely because the work was being done carefully, with attention to voices earlier generations had treated as background noise. Similar efforts appeared at other sites, each following its own path. In the Ford Homes Historic District, longtime residents began building their own archives. They recorded conversations with elderly neighbors who still remembered inspections, rent policies, and the early days on those streets. They photographed original details before renovations erased them. They gathered documents and stories that no official institution had ever bothered to collect. A retired auto worker named James, whose grandfather had been among the first tenants, became the unofficial historian of his block. He knew which houses still had original floor plans and which had been altered beyond recognition. He knew which families had stayed for generations and which had left after a single conflict with the company. He carried stories of inspections passed and failed, of neighbors who quietly helped each other survive layoffs, of the mixed emotions people felt toward a company that offered shelter while also setting the terms for how that shelter could be used. These projects operated mostly without institutional backing. No major foundation grants, no glossy brochures, just people who understood, on a gut level, that their histories mattered even if no one had ever written them down. The work continues today. Unfinished, underfunded, but stubbornly alive. Every stone reset at Fair Lane, every recorded memory from Dearborn, every photograph rescued from a family album amounts to a small act of reclamation. The buildings now belong less to the man who commissioned them and more to the people willing to care for them and to tell the full story of what happened inside their walls. And nowhere is this quiet transformation more unexpected than in the jungle town Henry Ford walked away from. A place where, among the ruins of someone else's failed experiment, a community has learned to live on its own terms. Chapter 9. The Second Life of Fordlândia. The water tower still bears the Ford logo. Rust has softened its edges, turned sharp letters into ghosts of themselves, but the name remains visible from the river, a metal landmark on the Tapajos, quietly pointing toward a town that was supposed to disappear and never did. Fordlândia today is home to roughly 3,000 people, not ghosts, not tourists, families who wake each morning in houses built for American rubber workers, who send their children to schools constructed with Michigan money, who shop in small stores that occupy buildings once meant for company purposes, no one even remembers anymore. The town was expected to die when Ford abandoned it. In 1945, the company sold the entire operation back to the Brazilian government for a fraction of what it had spent. Executives in Dearborn wrote off the losses and moved on. The rubber dream was finished. The jungle, they assumed, would quietly reclaim what remained. But people do not follow corporate logic. The workers who had built their lives in Fordlândia saw no reason to leave simply because distant shareholders had lost interest. The houses still stood. The hospital still functioned, at least in a basic way. The land, however poorly suited for rubber, could grow other crops. So they stayed. Decades passed. The American machinery rusted in place, too heavy to move, too expensive to repair, gradually absorbed into the landscape like industrial fossils. Children grew up playing in abandoned warehouses, turning conveyor belts into balance beams, climbing the water tower their grandparents had helped construct. They learned history not from textbooks, but from the physical evidence that surrounded them every day. A teacher named Lucia, her students know her simply as Professora, now leads lessons no curriculum in Dearborn ever imagined. She walks her classes through the old plantation rows, pointing out where rubber trees once stood before leaf blight destroyed them. She shows them the managers' houses on the hill, still larger and better ventilated than the workers' quarters below. She explains what those differences meant then, and what they still suggest now. Her lesson is not about cultivating resentment. Lucia teaches her students to understand the past without being trapped by it. The Americans arrived with money, confidence, and a plan that ignored what local people already knew. They failed. Then they left. But the town remained. And the people who stayed built something new out of what had been abandoned. Researchers arrived from time to time, drawn by Fordlandia's strange status as a failed utopia. Photographers frame shots of decaying infrastructure wrapped in vines, capturing the collision of tropical growth and industrial ruins. Journalists write articles about hubris, colonialism, and the limits of corporate power. They come, they observe, they take notes and images, and then they leave. The residents have learned how to receive these visitors without letting them define what the town is. Yes, Fordlândia has an unusual origin story. Yes, the ruins make striking photographs, but this is not a museum. It is a place where people work shifts, argue over bills, celebrate weddings, and worry about their children's futures, no matter what happened nearly 90 years ago. Some of the old buildings have found new purposes. A warehouse now stores agricultural equipment. A former administrative office houses a small clinic. A building once used for company meetings hosts church services and community gatherings. The infrastructure of control has been quietly repurposed to serve needs Ford's planners never considered, because they never asked what the community itself might want. The jungle, meanwhile, has proven more resilient than anyone in Dearborn ever predicted. Reforestation projects have begun to replace failed rubber groves with native species. Young people who might once have left for distant cities now find work in environmental restoration, turning the site of an ecological miscalculation into a living laboratory for recovery. Fordlândia has become something Henry Ford himself would never have understood, a place that belongs to the people who live there, not to the company that built it. A reminder that control, no matter how total it seems at first, eventually hits its limits. And in Michigan, far from the Tapajos, other communities are learning similar lessons, slowly reclaiming factories, streets, and houses that were designed for someone else's purposes and teaching them to serve the lives that remain. Chapter 10. Streets that Learn to Speak. The block party happens every August now. Folding tables stretch across lawns that company inspectors once measured for compliance. Children chase each other between houses whose original tenants lived under constant evaluation. The smell of grilled food drifts through air that once carried mostly factory smoke and quiet anxiety. The Ford Home's historic district has become something its designers never intended. A neighborhood, not a model community, not a demonstration project, not a laboratory for social engineering, just a place where people know each other's names, watch each other's children, argue about parking, property lines, and all the ordinary frictions of shared space. The streets that were built to showcase corporate benevolence have been reclaimed by the untidy warmth of actual human life. Margaret has lived on Norwood Street for 43 years. Her husband's family was among the original tenants, arriving in the 1920s, when the houses were new and the rules were strict. She remembers stories her mother-in-law told about the Sociological Department visits. The careful cleaning before inspectors arrived, the rehearsed answers to predictable questions, the relief when the front door finally closed and the family could exhale. Those days feel distant now, almost impossible to imagine. Margaret's grandchildren run through the same rooms where their great-great-grandparents once whispered, afraid of being overheard. The walls that witnessed so much careful performance now absorb the noise of birthday parties, holiday dinners, slammed doors, and arguments that no one bothers to hide. The historic designation, when it came, brought mixed feelings. Some residents welcomed the protection it offered against developers who had been circling for years, eager to demolish the old houses and build something taller, shinier, more profitable. Others worried about restrictions, about being told what colors they could paint their doors, about trading one form of control for another. The compromise emerged through community meetings that stretched late into the evenings. Residents would maintain historic character while keeping authority over their own properties. Outside experts could advise, but not command. The neighborhood would preserve its past without becoming a prisoner to it. Walking tours now bring visitors through streets that once admitted only employees and their families, docents, many of them longtime residents. Tell stories that company brochures never printed. They speak about wages that felt miraculous and surveillance that felt suffocating, about the gratitude workers genuinely felt and the resentment they carefully hid, about the complicated inheritance of living in houses built by people who wanted to control how you lived inside them. Robert leads one such tour every month. His grandfather worked at Rouge for 31 years, walked these same sidewalks thousands of times, raised children in a house that was never quite his, no matter how long he paid rent. Robert tells visitors about finding his grandfather's employee file in an archive, inspection reports, moral evaluations, the documented details of a private life turned into company property. The file made Robert angry at first, then sad, then determined. He began recording interviews with elderly residents, capturing memories before they disappeared. The project grew into an informal archive, boxes of photographs and documents stacked in his basement, a history assembled from fragments that no institution had thought worth preserving. Other residents added their own materials, letters, pay stubs, photographs of families posed stiffly in front of houses that represented both achievement and constraint. The collection has no official status, no professional cataloging, no climate-controlled storage. It exists because people decided their stories mattered enough to save. The neighborhood that was designed to demonstrate how workers should live has become a testament to how they actually did live, imperfectly, resiliently, on their own terms, even when those terms had to be negotiated inside systems they did not create. And across the water, another Ford property was undergoing its own transformation, shifting from private sanctuary to public inheritance. Chapter 11. Ford House. From private club to shared memory. The gates that once admitted only the carefully selected now swing open for anyone who can afford a ticket. Busloads of school children arrive at Gaukler Point on Tuesday mornings. They spill onto pathways originally designed for garden parties and diplomatic receptions, their voices echoing across lawns where Eleanor Ford once walked in quiet contemplation. Docents gather them into clusters, lead them through rooms filled with art that most of their parents could never dream of owning, past windows that frame a lake view worth more than entire city blocks. This was not the future the Fords imagined when they built their stone house on the water, but it is the future Eleanor chose once she understood what would happen without intervention. The donation in 1976 came with conditions, deliberately crafted to avoid the fate that had overtaken so many other Gilded Age estates. No subdivision, no demolition, no conversion into condominiums or corporate headquarters. The house would remain whole. The grounds would stay intact. The collection would be preserved in place. And crucially, the property would welcome visitors. Not as guests of the family, but as beneficiaries of a public trust. The transition took years. Staff had to be hired, systems invented, compromises found between preservation and access. Some rooms proved too fragile for heavy foot traffic. Others needed careful modifications to accommodate visitors with disabilities. A house built around the comfort and privacy of one family had to be quietly redesigned for thousands of strangers who would flow through it year after year. Jennifer has worked as a docent at Ford House for 11 years. She remembers her first tour, standing in the Great Hall, nervous about explaining the lives of people whose world seemed impossibly distant from her own. Over time, her approach changed. She moved away from reciting dates and design details and toward conversations. Now she asks questions as often as she answers them. She invites visitors to think about what it meant to live surrounded by such beauty, and to know exactly where it came from. The Rivera painting in the dining room becomes a doorway into discussions about labor and industry. The view across the lake opens space to talk about who has access to such vistas and who never did. The servants' quarters, modest rooms tucked out of sight, make visible the workforce that made all this elegance function day after day. Some visitors find these conversations uncomfortable. They arrive ready to admire chandeliers and carved stone, not to examine the history woven into them. Jennifer has learned to navigate that resistance gently. She offers complexity without forcing conclusions. The house contains contradictions. She lets guests feel them, rather than resolving everything neatly. School groups tend to cut through the reverence that adults bring. Children who have never seen a house this large ask blunt questions their teachers sometimes rush to soften. Why did they need so many rooms? Where did the workers sleep? Did the kids who lived here have friends from outside the rich neighborhoods? Their curiosity tears away the aura of untouchable grandeur and demands that the past be treated as a human story, not just a museum set. Outside, the grounds have become community space in ways Eleanor might not have predicted, but would likely have appreciated. Wedding parties pose on the terrace, where she once hosted diplomats and business partners. Families spread blankets on lawns maintained by crews whose work echoes that of earlier gardeners. Summer concerts draw crowds that fill the air with folding chairs, plastic cups, and applause, where once there had been only carefully controlled guest lists. Ford House has not erased its history of exclusivity. The stone walls still speak in the language of wealth and power. The art collection still represents purchasing power far beyond ordinary imagination, but within that frame, something has shifted. The property now serves purposes its builders never intended, welcomes people they never would have admitted, and gives space to stories they never wanted highlighted. This transformation, from family sanctuary to public resource, offers one version of what great houses can become. Not mausoleums frozen at a single moment of glory, but living institutions capable of being reinterpreted. Places where the past remains visible and honest, but does not dictate who is allowed in or what must be believed. And back in Dearborn, at the estate where this particular story began, a similar possibility was finally taking shape, as another mansion slowly learned how to open its doors to the world outside. Chapter 12. New Storytellers. The camera light blinks red in the Great Hall of Fair Lane. Outside, restoration crews continue their patient work on the limestone facade. Inside, a young filmmaker adjusts his tripod on floors that once felt the footsteps of industrialists, presidents, and servants who moved like shadows. Marcus came to this project by accident rather than intention. A simple documentary assignment for a local television station brought him to Fair Lane on a public tour. Something about the place unsettled him. Not the grandeur which he had expected, but the silences. The gaps in the official narrative where other stories should have been. He began returning on his own time, interviewing archivists, tracking down descendants of former staff, piecing together accounts that had never been gathered into a single telling. The project grew beyond anything the television station wanted or could broadcast. Marcus kept working anyway. His documentary will not be a celebration of Henry Ford's genius, nor will it be a straightforward indictment of his flaws. Marcus has learned that the most honest histories resist both temptations. They sit with contradiction, allow complexity to remain unresolved, and trust audiences to draw their own conclusions. The film includes footage from all the sites that once formed Ford's domestic empire. Fair Lane, restored, and still restoring. The workers' houses in Dearborn, now lived in by families who have made them entirely their own. Gaukler Point, transformed into a public trust on the shore of Lake St. Clair, and Fordlândia, where children play beneath a rusted water tower that still bears a famous name. Marcus maps these locations not as separate curiosities, but as expressions of a single vision. The same impulse that designed hidden servant corridors at Fair Lane also produced inspection programs for workers' homes. The same philosophy that controlled meal schedules in the mansion also imposed American food on Brazilian laborers in the jungle. The scale changed from estate to neighborhood to company town. The underlying logic remained constant, but the map now includes another layer: the people who have reclaimed these spaces, the historians recovering erased stories, the residents who turned model houses into actual homes, the community in Brazil that refused to disappear when the company withdrew, the visitors who walk through Ford House and Fair Lane asking questions earlier generations would never have voiced out loud. The documentary ends not with Ford's death, but with a scene from a recent summer afternoon. A neighborhood gathering on one of the old company streets in Dearborn. Elderly residents who remember the last traces of corporate oversight share folding tables with young families who know the history only from stories. Children run across lawns that were once measured for compliance. Laughter rises in spaces designed for control. Marcus films without narration. The images speak for themselves. Here is what was built. Here is what it cost. Here is what remains. Here is what people have made from it. The Great Hall of Fair Lane holds echoes of all these stories. The room where Ford once entertained according to rigid protocols now hosts school groups, community events, and visitors from around the world. The restoration continues, year after year, revealing layers that time had hidden and earlier tours ignored. The house now tells a fuller story than its builder ever intended to share. A new generation of storytellers has emerged. Filmmakers, oral historians, community archivists, preservation specialists who understand that saving buildings means saving the complexity of what happened inside them. They work without the vast resources Ford commanded, without the certainty that drove his projects, without the assumption that their vision should override all others. What they offer instead is something Ford could never have provided: honesty about costs, respect for voices he ignored, a willingness to let history remain uncomfortable rather than forcing it into satisfying shapes. The mansion empire is passing from the hands that built it into the hands of those who will carry it forward. What they make of it and what they choose to remember remains to be seen. Chapter 13. Light in the Windows. The evening sun catches the restored glass of Fair Lane's west windows. For the first time in decades, the light falls as it was designed to fall, through panes that match the originals, across rooms returned to something close to their early condition. But the house is no longer waiting for Henry Ford to approve the arrangements. A group of university students crosses the great lawn, notebooks in hand. Their assignment is not to admire the architecture, but to interrogate it. How does space communicate power? What do floor plans reveal about who mattered and who did not? Which doors were meant to be seen, and which were meant to stay invisible? The questions would have bewildered the home's original owners. They would have seemed impertinent, perhaps even dangerous. Now they form the backbone of a semester's work. The powerhouse runs again, its turbines restored by engineers who treated the project as both historical preservation and practical training. Electricity flows from the Rouge River just as Ford intended, though the purpose has changed. What was once a demonstration of one man's self-sufficiency now powers classrooms, archives, and workshops that serve thousands of students and visitors each year. In Dearborn, the sun sets over streets that have outlived their original purpose. Porch lights flicker on in houses built as instruments of control and now used as ordinary homes. The sameness that was once enforced, identical setbacks, regulated paint colors, approved landscaping, has given way to the gentle chaos of personal taste. One yard holds a vegetable garden. Another displays a crowded collection of ceramic figures no sociological department would have approved. A third has been poured in concrete for basketball, the hoop slightly crooked, the painted lines fading under scuffed shoes. Children who will never hear about inspection visits or conditional tenancy shoot baskets until their parents call them inside. They slam screen doors, argue over bedtimes, complain about homework. The rules that once governed these streets exist only in archives and fading memories. The houses remain. The surveillance has ended. At Gaukler Point, the lake reflects the last light of day. Visitors linger on the terrace where Eleanor Ford once stood watching distant factory fires. The view has changed. Fewer smokestacks now, more trees. A skyline reshaped by deindustrialization and new development. But the water still moves toward the horizon with the same patient rhythm that framed her evenings. A wedding party poses for photographs on the lawn. The couple knows something of the house's past, but has chosen the location for its beauty rather than its pedigree. Their guests wander through gardens that were once strictly private, admiring flowers they could not have seen a generation ago. The estate has shifted from boundary to backdrop, a setting that now belongs to occasions instead of owners. And in Fordlândia, night falls over the Amazon. The water tower disappears into darkness, its Ford logo invisible until morning. Below it, the town glows with scattered lights, homes where families gather around televisions and dinner tables, a bar where workers relax despite prohibitions that ended before their grandparents were born. A school where tomorrow's lesson will include the strange history of why this settlement exists at all. The empires of control leave ruins, but not empty ones. The jungle reclaims plantations, yet people plant new crops between old rows. Rivers erode the foundations of powerhouses, yet engineers come back to stabilize what can still be used. Time softens the edges of the strictest designs, and the most rigid plans slowly bend under the weight of ordinary lives. What endures is not the vision of any single architect, but the accumulated choices of everyone who came after. Fair Lane will continue its slow restoration. The workers' houses will continue their quiet evolution into an ordinary neighborhood with an extraordinary backstory. Ford House will welcome another generation of visitors with questions its builders never anticipated. Fordlândia will remain inhabited and improbable, a monument both to the failure of imposed dreams and to the resilience of communities that refuse to vanish. The lights in the windows are not the same lights that once burned there. The people inside are not the same people. The stories told about these places grow more complex every year, folding in voices that were once kept outside the gates or confined to the servants' halls. This is what remains of Henry Ford's mansion empire. Not what he built, but what others have made, and are still making, from the structures he left behind. Chapter 14. What the Door Remembers. The brass doorknob at Fair Lane's main entrance has been turned perhaps 1,000,000 times. Hands in white gloves during formal dinners. Calloused palms of workers delivering supplies. Fingers trembling with nerves before important meetings. The metal has worn smooth in places, shaped by decades of arrivals and departures, by all the hopes and fears that have passed through this threshold. This morning, a docent named Sarah polishes that knob before the first tour. No one has told her she must. There is no checklist that requires it. She does it because the gesture connects her, in a small, tangible way, to everyone who has touched this same surface before. Industrialists and servants, family members and strangers, the powerful and the forgotten. She thinks about hands. Ford's hands, which reportedly never lost the roughness of his farm boy years despite his wealth. Clara's hands, arranging flowers in vases throughout the house, creating softness inside stone walls. The hands of maids scrubbing floors before dawn. Gardeners pruning roses in heavy summer heat. Chauffeurs gripping steering wheels while waiting for instructions that might not come until midnight. The door remembers none of this and all of it. Objects absorb history without understanding it. They persist, while the people who use them disappear. This doorknob will outlast Sarah, just as it outlasted Henry Ford, just as it will outlast today's visitors who brush past it without a second thought. Humans are not objects. Humans remember selectively, interpret constantly, revise their stories again and again. The way people talk about Fair Lane has changed with every generation. Ford's contemporaries saw a monument to American ingenuity. Later critics saw evidence of megalomania and control. Current interpreters try to hold both views at once, acknowledging achievement without ignoring cost, admiring the engineering while naming the harm. The same process unfolds across the former mansion empire. In the workers' houses, descendants re-examine family legends and discover that the prosperity they inherited came wrapped in conditions their grandparents rarely described in detail. At Ford House, curators revisit collections and labels, asking which voices have been amplified and which have been pushed to the margins. In Fordlândia, residents shape identities that include the American episode, without letting it define who they are. Memory is not preservation. Preservation tries to stop time, to hold a moment in place against the erosion of years. Memory moves. It changes shape. It bends to the needs and questions of the present. The houses can be restored to an approximation of their original appearance. The memories of what happened inside them cannot be put back the way they were. That may be the mansion empire's most important lesson. Control fails not only because systems break down, or workers revolt, or jungles resist cultivation. Control fails because meaning cannot be frozen. Every generation reinterprets what it inherits. Every community reshapes the spaces it occupies. Every person who passes through a door carries in their own understanding and leaves with a different one. Henry Ford wanted to build environments that would shape behavior permanently. Houses that would make workers orderly, estates that would model proper living, company towns that would turn jungle populations into productive Americans. The physical structures often worked exactly as planned. The psychological programming never fully did. The people who lived in these spaces adapted, resisted, subverted, endured. They smuggled their own habits and beliefs into rooms designed to correct them. They maintained identities inside systems designed to remake them. They passed down stories that contradicted official narratives. They waited out the empire and then reclaimed what was left. Sarah finishes polishing and steps back. The doorknob gleams, ready for another day of hands. In a few minutes, the first visitors will arrive. Families, students, historians, curious strangers. Each will touch this same metal. Each will cross this same threshold. Each will take away a different sense of what this house is and what it means. The door swings open. Morning light spills across the entrance hall. Another day begins at Fair Lane. And the story shifts again, ever so slightly, with everyone who enters and everyone who leaves. The mansion empire has become something its builder never imagined. Not a fixed monument to one man's vision, but an ongoing conversation among all the people his vision touched, and all the people who have come after, determined to tell the whole story, not just the one written on the blueprints. Chapter 15. The Question That Remains. A child stands in the great hall of Fair Lane, neck craned back, trying to make sense of the ceiling. Her classmates have already scattered through the room, leaning over fireplaces, tracing carvings on window frames, counting the patterns in the wooden floor. She stays where she is, eyes wide, pinned in place by the sheer size of everything around her. How big does a house need to be? No worksheet asks her this. No docent has planted the thought. The question arrives on its own, pulled out of her by a space so far from her everyday life that her mind reaches for an explanation and finds only more questions. Her teacher notices and walks over, lowering herself to the child's eye level. "What are you thinking about?" The girl makes a vague circle in the air with her hand. The walls, the ceiling, the room itself. Why did they need all this room? That simple question echoes through every corner of Ford's mansion empire. The 56 rooms at Fair Lane, the stone house on Lake St. Clair, the rows of workers' homes laid out like products on an assembly line, the entire American town carved out of the Amazon jungle. Each one is an answer to a hidden question about how life should be organized, and each, when seen honestly, provokes the same response from the people who walk through them now. Why this way? Who decided? What did it cost? The answers are not simple or comfortable. Henry Ford believed sincerely in the idea of improvement. He believed that the right environment could lift people, that well-designed systems could eliminate waste, vice, even suffering. He saw his vision of order as progress, not as control. Wages at his plants changed lives. Company houses offered running water, heat, and indoor bathrooms to families who had never known them. Hospitals and schools in Ford Landia treated real illnesses and taught real children. Whatever else they were meant to accomplish, but belief does not erase consequence. The Sociological Department still pushed its way into private lives, no matter how many pay envelopes it also delivered. The conditional nature of company housing still hung over families like a quiet threat. One argument at work, one bad report, and home could vanish. The enforcement of American customs on Brazilian workers still carried the message that one culture counted and the other needed to be corrected. The mansion empire was not simply good or bad. It was both at once, in proportions that cannot be measured with a single verdict. The houses contain evidence for every interpretation: beauty and coercion, generosity and intrusion, comfort and anxiety. The archives hold documents that point in opposing directions. The descendants of workers and owners alike carry memories that refuse to flatten into a neat summary. What remains in the end is less a final judgment than an invitation. The places still exist. The records can be read. New stories keep emerging as new researchers ask different questions. Anyone who wants to understand what Ford built and what it meant to those who had to live inside his designs can visit, listen, argue, and decide what they think for themselves. The child in the Great Hall will not settle any of this today. She will drift back to her group, see more rooms, hear more dates and names, eventually climb onto a bus that will take her back to her own small house on an ordinary street. But something has lodged in her thoughts, a tiny shift in how she sees space and power, a sense that houses are not neutral, that the rooms people build reveal what they believe about themselves and about everyone else. That architecture is always also an opinion. Perhaps she will return someday, older, armed with different questions and a notebook of her own. Perhaps she will become one of the researchers, preservationists, or filmmakers who carry this story forward. Perhaps she will simply remember this moment, the vastness of the hall, the strangeness of such scale, the first flicker of doubt about how the world is arranged and who benefits from that arrangement. The Mansion Empire asks questions that do not have final answers. Each generation responds according to its own values, its own fears, its own sense of what human beings owe one another. The child looks up at the ceiling for one last second. Then she runs to rejoin her classmates, leaving the great hall to its echoing quiet, to its memories, its scars, and its patient waiting for the next person who will stand in that same spot, look up, and wonder. Chapter 16. Inheriting the Empire. The lawyer's office in Detroit holds no trace of grandeur. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. Worn carpet buckles near the door. A conference table scarred by decades of tense meetings dominates the room. Yet the papers spread across its surface reach back to marble halls, jungle plantations, and narrow streets where workers once lived under constant scrutiny. A woman named Catherine sits across from the attorney, reviewing documents that will determine the future of a small house in Dearborn. Her grandmother purchased it in 1952, 7 years after Ford sold the workers' housing to individual buyers. 3 generations have lived within its walls. Now Catherine must decide whether to keep, sell, or donate a property whose market value has multiplied roughly 100-fold since her grandmother signed the original deed. She is far from alone in facing this kind of choice. Across the former empire, descendants confront questions of inheritance that reach well beyond simple arithmetic. What does it mean to own a fragment of this history? What obligations come with that ownership? Which stories are attached to the property? And who has the right or the responsibility to tell them? Catherine's grandmother rarely spoke about the early years. The inspection visits, the unease of living under standards that were never fully explained but always enforced. The way neighbors whispered about the Sociological Department. The wave of relief that passed through the street when Ford finally sold the houses and the new owners could paint their doors any color they wished. These memories appeared only in scattered comments, fragments that Catherine collected without grasping their full weight. Now holding the deed, she understands something her grandmother may never have put into words. Ownership alters the relationship completely. The house that had functioned as an instrument of corporate control became, through purchase, a site of family autonomy. Her grandmother did not just buy a structure. She bought the power to decide. She bought the right to say no. She bought freedom from conditions that had governed the property since its construction. The question now is what Catherine will do with that freedom. Developers have approached her more than once, offering sums that would fundamentally change her financial life. The lot itself, they explain, is worth more than the aging house that sits on it. They talk about opportunity, upgrades, density, unlocking value. They talk about square footage and zoning. They do not talk about inspections or anxiety or the history embedded in those walls. Other inheritors have chosen different paths. Some have placed preservation easements on their properties, legally binding agreements that protect historic features even if the house is later sold. Others have donated homes to historical societies or community land trusts, trading private control for public access. A few have opened their doors for occasional tours, becoming informal curators of their own family archives, guiding visitors through rooms layered with inherited stories. There is no single correct answer. The houses of Ford's empire are too numerous, too uneven in condition, too differently located to allow one rule. Each inheritor must weigh personal needs against historical significance, immediate financial pressure against long-term preservation, individual rights against the broader community's interest in remembering how these places came to be. Slowly, almost quietly, a loose network has begun to form. Descendants find one another in online forums, trading scans of old inspection reports and pay stubs. Local gatherings bring together owners from different streets to compare notes on maintenance, zoning battles, and preservation strategies. Scholars and amateurs share research. Out of these conversations has grown a fragile but real awareness that these houses, scattered across cities and continents, amount to a collective inheritance that no single owner can protect alone. Catherine leaves the lawyer's office without signing anything. She folds the documents into a neat stack, slips them back into a worn envelope, and steps out into downtown Detroit. She needs time. She needs to walk through the house again, to sit at the kitchen table where her grandmother served meals for 50 years, to stand in the small yard that was once subject to company inspection and now is simply, undeniably, her family's ground. The empire that Ford built was designed to endure beyond any individual life. The factories, he believed, would outlast their workers. The houses would outlast their tenants. The systems of control would perpetuate themselves even as names on office doors changed. It has not worked that way. The factories have mostly closed or been repurposed. The formal systems of control have collapsed. What remains are properties held by individuals who must decide one by one what to preserve, what to alter, and what to let go. Catherine will make her choice eventually. So will thousands of others facing similar decisions in Dearborn, along Lake St. Clair, in the shadow of rusted water towers on the Tapajos. The empire is being dismantled and reimagined deed by deed, signature by signature, in ways its founder never anticipated and could never have controlled. Chapter 17. The Map Redrawn. The projection screen glows in a darkened classroom at the University of Michigan Dearborn. A graduate student named David clicks through slides that took him more than 3 years to assemble. Maps overlay maps. Timelines cross and knot. Photographs from different decades sit side by side, compressing generations into a single frame and daring the audience to trace the connections. His dissertation makes a claim that would have sounded impossible to earlier scholars. The Ford Mansion empire was not an aberration, it was a template. The techniques Ford helped normalize, company housing tied directly to employment, domestic surveillance disguised as welfare, architectural design used to shape private behavior, did not vanish when Ford's experiments ended. They evolved. They spread into corporate campuses, planned communities, and homeowners associations that regulate everything from mailbox height to acceptable holiday decorations. David traces those lineages carefully. The Sociological Department's home inspection protocols echo in modern employment background checks that sift through social media histories and personal networks. The conditional nature of Ford housing reappears in corporate relocation packages, that offer subsidized homes and schools while quietly deepening dependence. The standardized workers' streets foreshadow the enforced uniformity of suburban subdivisions where variation is prohibited by covenant and color charts. He is precise about the limits of the analogy. The comparison is not perfect. Modern employers rarely send inspectors into kitchens to check for cleanliness. Contemporary planned communities do not usually tie residents to a single factory job. The tools have changed. The control has become softer, more distributed, less visible, but not necessarily weaker. What David's research reveals is a persistent impulse, the recurring desire of organizations to extend their reach beyond the workplace, to shape not only how people work, but how they eat, sleep, spend time, even raise children. Ford expressed that desire with unusual bluntness. His successors learned to code it in different language. The slides advance. Fair Lane appears alongside corporate headquarters that include apartments, gyms, cafeterias, and wellness spaces designed to keep employees on site as many hours as possible. The Ford Landia hospital shares a slide with contemporary wellness programs that track employee step counts, heart rates, and sleep patterns, adjusting insurance premiums accordingly. The workers' houses sit opposite new workforce housing complexes where nurses, teachers, and warehouse workers live in employer-subsidized units they can lose the moment they switch jobs. David pauses often to qualify his claims. Correlation is not causation. Similar forms can emerge from very different motives. Not every attempt to improve workers' lives hides a desire to control them. His map is offered as a set of patterns and questions, not as a conspiracy chart with red string tying everything to Ford. Even so, the pattern is hard to ignore. Organizations with enough resources continue to test ways of expanding their influence into employees' non-work hours. The boundary between professional and personal life, never as solid as ideology suggested, grows thinner with each technological advance. Smartphones carry the workplace into bedrooms and vacations. Remote work brings monitoring software into family living rooms. The factory whistle that once marked the end of the workday has been replaced by notification chimes that never fully stop. Ford would recognize the underlying impulse, even if the methods would puzzle him. He believed human life could be optimized, that the right systems could eliminate wasted motion in homes just as they did on assembly lines. That belief outlived him. It changed its vocabulary, from efficiency to wellness, from order to culture fit. But the core idea remained. The classroom lights rise. Students shift in their seats and begin to ask questions that make clear how entangled they already are in the systems David has mapped. They live in dormitories governed by detailed codes of conduct. They work part-time jobs managed through scheduling apps that track availability down to the minute. They inhabit digital platforms that log their preferences, locations, and purchases with a precision Henry Ford could never have imagined, but would probably have admired. The mansion empire, David suggests, was not an endpoint. It was an early chapter. The questions it raises about the limits of organizational power, about the line between help and control, about who gets to decide how others should live, those questions have not been settled. If anything, they have become more urgent. David closes his laptop. The projection screen goes dark. Conversations break out in small clusters around the room. Students comparing notes on their own workplaces, their own leases, their own rules. The maps may be finished for now, but the argument they started continues long after the seminar ends. Chapter 18. The door opens. The morning light falls differently on Fair Lane now. The last pieces of scaffolding have come down from the east wing. For the first time in many years, nothing interrupts the line of the roof or hides the stonework. The limestone glows as it did about a century ago, even though the house it encloses now serves purposes its builder never planned. A visitor walks up the path toward the main entrance. She is not wealthy. She has no connections. No chauffeur waits at the drive. She carries no handwritten invitation on thick cream paper. She bought a ticket the night before on her phone, drove in from a small apartment in a nearby city, and parked in a lot that once held the cars of industrialists, dignitaries, and carefully chosen guests. The brass doorknob turns beneath her hand. The same knob Henry Ford once grasped, the same metal servants touched as they slipped in and out in near silence, the same threshold that for decades marked a hard line between those who belonged and those who did not. She steps inside. The great hall opens before her. Tall, echoing, strange, and yet unexpectedly approachable. Docents greet her with easy smiles and offer maps instead of instructions. Other visitors move through the space at their own pace, families shepherding distracted children, elderly couples taking slow, careful steps, students clutching notebooks, tourists speaking languages that never reached these walls during the Ford years. What was once an empire of control has shifted into something quieter and more complicated. The house has become a place of questions instead of commands, of tours instead of orders. A space where anyone who can get here and buy a ticket can walk in, look around, and decide for themselves what they think of it all. Outside, the Rouge River keeps sliding past, indifferent to human plans. Its water still feeds the powerhouse channel. The turbines turn as they have for roughly a century, taking motion and turning it into electricity. The system Ford designed still works, but its output has changed ownership. Now it powers classrooms, exhibits, and restoration work instead of a single family's private grid. Across Dearborn, the workers' streets ease into another ordinary day. Children wait for school buses on sidewalks. Their great-great-grandparents once walked under worried eyes, wondering how an inspection would go. The houses along those blocks are painted in shades the Sociological Department would never have allowed. Bright doors, mismatched shutters, gardens that follow personal taste instead of printed diagrams. Some yards grow tomatoes beside roses. Others are cluttered, lived in, unmistakably free. The neighborhood breathes on its own. At Gaukler Point, the lake catches the same morning sun that once lit up the windows of Edsel and Eleanor's rooms. Staff unlock doors and switch on lights. Tours will begin within the hour. Phones will ring in the office with questions about wedding dates and photo permits. Grounds crews will move through beds and borders, tending gardens that now belong, in a real sense, to anyone who shows up. And in Fordlândia, under the rusted water tower with its fading Ford logo, another day starts in the Amazon heat. Families wake, make breakfast, head to work and school. Some will spend the afternoon in buildings once meant for company purposes, now repurposed for local needs. They are not living the lives Henry Ford planned for them. They are living their own lives, shaped by local decisions, local desires, local realities. The mansion empire has not vanished. Its stones still stand. Its streets still exist. Its water towers still rise above trees and rooftops. But the meaning attached to those structures has shifted. The same walls now hold different stories. The same designs now serve people who were never supposed to be the main characters. The visitor at Fair Lane lingers a moment longer in the great hall, then follows a docent toward the next room. Behind her, the brass knob settles back into place, ready for the next hand, the next arrival. The door that once kept most people out now waits, open, for whoever comes next.